Welcome to today's webinar on disproportionality, creating an infrastructure for results. This presentation was made in collaboration between the Anne Arundel County Public School System and the American Institutes for Research. Today's goals include engaging in professional learning and collaboration to support school teams in developing the leadership systems and infrastructure needed to address significant disproportionality, conduct a root cause analysis, and create an action plan for addressing significant disproportionality based on the framework for an action plan. Here's our agenda for today. The first item is systemic infrastructure, where we're going to learn the importance of infrastructure to support proactive responses. The second item is build a team. We're going to understand components of an effective team. The third item is define the problem, where we'll learn about developing a problem statement. The fourth item is understand root causes and identifying the underlying or the root cause of the problem. The fifth item on the agenda is a plan for action. We're going to learn about setting a measurable goal and selecting appropriate practices. The sixth item is to implement and refine or develop a monitoring plan. You'll see this visual graphic here on this slide multiple times throughout this presentation. This is our 5-step process that we will be working through today. Let's start by discussing systemic infrastructure. So we know that addressing disproportionality relies on solid infrastructural systems and practices. When we're talking about infrastructure, what do we mean? We're referring to any systems, staffing, resources, etc. All of these different elements help support your infrastructure. Solid infrastructure ensures time for collaboration among staff to plan and implement practices that address disproportionality, provides ongoing professional learning, resources, support, etc. that address cultural responsiveness, evidence-based practices, or high-leverage practices. We want to make sure that our approach is based on the rigorous research. Solid infrastructure also evaluates and monitors fidelity of programs or practices that address disproportionality. All of these different components must be addressed with intentionality so that we can make sure that we are aligning our different systems and resources with our initiatives to address disproportionality. It is important to remember that if you fail to plan, then you plan to fail. We need to make sure that we have planning embedded within our infrastructure so that we can ensure that these different processes are occurring to address disproportionality. Some examples of different processes that we want to see take place include scheduling, planning, and data reviews, completing a root cause analysis, identifying key practices to focus on, etc. Thinking about things like cultural responsive practices and our MTSS system and how these different pieces fit together, that takes time and planning as well. We are now going to discuss building a team. Building a team is the first step out of 5 that we are using in our framework to address disproportionality. As you and your team work together to address significant disproportionality within your local education agency, you'll engage in some form of this process. And today you'll be hearing about several important strategies to consider as you and your team develop an action plan for change. So thinking about effective teams, I would like you to take just a moment to think about what are some obstacles that are keeping you or your school from implementing effective teams. Feel free to pause the video to discuss what are obstacles that might be keeping you from implementing effective teams. At this time, I also want to take a moment to highlight the icon in the middle of the screen. Anytime you see this icon during today's presentation, you can know that there is a corresponding activity within the participant guidebook. So what are some characteristics of effective teams? We know that effective teams have a clear mission and purpose. There are clear norms and meeting rules. There is a structured agenda. There's an annual timetable for agenda items. It's important to know that in an effective team, that everyone knows their purpose and their role within these meetings. It can be helpful to have a meeting cadence, so making sure that meetings are scheduled out months in advance so everyone knows when they're coming up and everyone can be prepared. Effective teams also integrate problem solving and decision making processes. They also have integrated student requests for assistance. And they also have data-based decision-making rules. And that is a very critical feature of effective teaming as well, because we want to make sure that everyone is on the same page about different processes and how we are approaching the data and how we are using the data to inform decision-making related to academic success, related to discipline, related to MTSS tiers, so on and so forth. Thinking about your school level leadership team, it is important to remember that the exact composition of your school level team is going to vary depending on the size of your school, whether it's elementary, middle school, or high school, the size of your student population, your personnel and resources that are available, etc. But as far as core members of the team, we want to make sure that the required members include an administrator, so either the principal or an assistant principal, and classroom teachers or grade level representatives at minimum. Other recommended members include assistant principals, or if your school has a dean of instruction, any literacy or math coaches, or perhaps you have a data coach, someone who would be knowledgeable about data and assessments that are occurring and have access to that type of information. Reading interventionists or specialists, math interventionists and specialists, any ELL or bilingual specialists, as special education teachers, school psychologists, social workers, speech language pathologists. There are many others that could be included on this list, but essentially anyone who might have some insight into academic success, progress, discipline, and could help really think through what are some contributing factors that might be attributing or contributing to the disproportionality that is occurring. While every school always has many initiatives going on at one time, and there may be other teams that are already in place within a school, it is really important to understand the value of having a school level leadership team that is addressing disproportionality intentionally. And the reason why is because this team can promote a common understanding and vision around addressing significant disproportionality. They can also communicate how addressing disproportionality interacts with other current initiatives, such as working on state standards, implementing positive behavior interventions and supports, etc. Any other initiatives that might be occurring if, for example, your school is focused on enhancing reading skills for students. We really want to make sure that we're considering how these initiatives are related to the issue of disproportionality within the school. This team can also help consider the cultural and contextual needs of the school population and really get a good bird's eye view of the context and everything that's going on that's contributing to disproportionality. They will also help lead the implementation of evidence-based practices. So thinking about instituting a progress monitoring protocol, determining the efficacy of practices, and making any data-based decisions, they can be the leaders in these different initiatives, help model it, help support the teachers in learning the different steps to implement these different protocols. And they can also help make collaborative decisions about moving students between MTSS tiers and or recommending special education evaluation. So looking at some common team structures that are already in place in many schools, here are a few examples of teams that perhaps you might have some of these within your own school system. First, we have the school level MTSS team. And so this team often is looking at assessment data, universal screening data in particular, progress monitoring data, and making determinations about students moving between tiers or making determinations about how many students are going to be receiving tier 2 and tier 3 services, etc. And then there's the instructional leadership team, and this might be called something different within your district, but often this is the team that handles curriculum level decisions. And so looking at different programs and their efficacy, how things are going, what resources are needed to be able to implement programs with fidelity, and they can also help monitor the fidelity of the curriculum programs that are in place. And then you have a grade level team, and often this team is focused on standards and working through the curriculum, lesson planning together collaboratively, making sure that they are addressing the needs of the students within their own classrooms. And then there is a special education referral team. And so this team will collaborate with the other team members to gain some information and data to help make decisions on whether or not students will be recommended for special education evaluation. So something to think about with these different team structures is how can these different teams work together to address disproportionality? And thinking about the previous slide and a school level leadership team, how can these different teams collaborate to address disproportionality? At this time, I would like you to turn to your workbook and complete the following prompt. We're now going to define the problem. Looking at our 5-step framework for addressing disproportionality, we are now defining the problem. So we started by building a team, and now that team is going to look at defining the problem prior to working to understand the root causes. Looking at the research for disproportionality, we know that culturally and linguistically diverse students, or CLD students, are overrepresented in the high-incidence IDEA disability categories. Those categories include specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, other health impaired, and autism spectrum disorder. We also know that CLD students are disproportionately subject to exclusionary disciplinary practices. And unfortunately, race remains a significant predictor of academic outcomes even when controlling for poverty. So we've learned a little bit about how disproportionality impacts some of our students, but what exactly is disproportionality? Disproportionality refers to a group's representation in a particular category that exceeds our expectations for that group or differs substantially from the representation of others in that category. Unfortunately, disproportionate representation of CLD students in special education is a long-standing issue that has been discussed in special education literature for more than 30 years. That's one of the many reasons why it's important to start focusing our energy and resources on addressing significant disproportionality. The IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, outlines 17 indicators that are measures of compliance and effectiveness of a state's implementation of the IDEA. States are required to report indicator outcomes within their State Performance Plan, or SIP, and their Annual Performance Report, or APR, to the Office of Special Education Programs out of the U.S. Department of Education on an annual basis. IDEA Indicator Number 9 requires states to report the percent of districts with disproportionate representation of racial and ethnic groups in special education and related services that is the result of inappropriate identification. The IDEA also requires states to collect and examine data to determine if significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity is occurring in the state and the local educational agencies, or LEAs, of the state with respect to the identification of children with disabilities, including the identification of children with particular disabilities, the placement in particular educational settings of such children, and the incidence, duration, and type of disciplinary actions, including suspensions and expulsions. In light of these federal reporting requirements, we can see how critical it is to implement effective evidence-based practices and frameworks such as multi-tier system of supports, database decision-making, positive behavior supports, etc., so that we can address and reduce the disproportionate representation of these racial and ethnic groups within special education. Now that we've discussed the importance of systemic infrastructure, building a team, and defined the problem of disproportionality, let's define the problem on a more local level. It's important to review data to identify areas for growth and a plan to address significant disproportionality. Here are 3 steps for conducting a data review. The first is to analyze and interpret data collaboratively. So think back to the teaming structures that we discussed earlier, the different teams within a school, including the school leadership team, the MTSS team, the special education referral team, etc. We want to make sure that we are working across the board to interpret the data collaboratively. The second step is to develop meaningful problem statements, and we're going to dive into that in just a few moments. The third step is to prioritize areas for a root cause analysis. We will also be discussing this shortly. A prioritized set of problem statements, when grounded in data, sets a team up for success and will have a positive impact on significant disproportionality. Our second step for the data review included developing meaningful problem statements. How do we do that? The first step to developing problem statements is to understand individual data sources and reports. The second step is identifying possible problem statements based on the data sources. The third step is to develop problem statements based on data and team input. The fourth step is to prioritize problem statements. So thinking about these data sources, note that it's sources plural and reports plural, meaning we want to make sure that we are looking at multiple pieces of information. It should never just be one set of data, one test score, or one disciplinary referral that we are using to make our decisions. We want to make sure that we are looking at the whole child and considering multiple pieces of information. These pieces of information become critical in helping us identify problem statements, and it is essential to have that team ready to collaborate so that we can better interpret the different pieces of information and data that we are gathering and then prioritize our problem statements. At this time, we're going to go ahead and work on developing a problem statement. You'll notice the icon on the top right corner, meaning that there is a corresponding activity within your participant guidebook. It is important to remember that when you are developing these problem statements, to keep them clear, complete, specific, and singular. What do we mean by that? By clear, we mean that anyone could understand the meaning without any further explanation. The statement should be complete, meaning that it is a complete thought and a sentence. It should be specific, so it is referring directly to data. And it should be singular. We're going to focus on one problem at a time. Here are 2 examples of problem statements to help you develop yours. The first example is teachers and staff on campus disproportionately referred 4 times as many African American and Black students for special education services than white students. The second problem statement example is Hispanic students are 3 times more likely than their peers to spend more than 40% of the day being pulled out of the classroom to a special education setting. Notice how these statements are clear, they're complete, they're specific, but they are also singular. We are now moving on to understand root causes. Understanding root causes is the third step within our 5-step cycle for addressing significant disproportionality. Notice that this step takes place after we define the problem. So now that we have a better understanding of the problem that we are dealing with, we can understand the root causes of that problem. And then from there, we will be able to develop a plan for action. A root cause analysis, or RCA, is a method of collective problem solving used for identifying the root causes, faults, or problems. This method often involves surveying multiple faculty or staff within a school or within a district. This method will look at different elements or contributing factors of significant disproportionality. This root cause tree diagram uses 3 phases to break down the root cause analysis process. The first is calculating disparities. Calculating disparities is when you compare the rates of over-identification of special education across different groups. This comparison of data will help inform the problem statement. During the root cause analysis, we may identify multiple causes or contributing factors, such as poor attendance or disciplinary referrals. But what is the root cause? In other words, what is causing the poor attendance and disciplinary referrals? Are there ineffective or inappropriate disciplinary measures in place? Once these root causes are identified, then we can take corrective actions by creating an action plan. A few examples of root cause contributing factors include a lack of access to scientifically based instruction, economic, cultural, and linguistic barriers, a lack of access to appropriate diagnostic screenings, and an inappropriate use of disciplinary removals. These are just a few examples, and it's quite possible that your school may identify other examples of root causes. We are now moving on to our section on a plan for action. We are now going to plan for action. This is the 4th step out of 5 in our framework for addressing significant disproportionality. Now that we have understood the root causes for the problems that we defined earlier, we can go ahead and plan for action, meaning start taking steps to address these underlying root causes. After we have developed a plan for action, then we can look at how we are going to implement and refine our plan. Now that we've identified root causes and reviewed our data, it's time to set a goal. Be sure to remember that it is important to define everyone's roles for achieving the goal so we are all on the same page with next steps. It is also important to ensure that the goal is SMART. We will talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. It is also important to remember that the IDEA requires assessing and revising policies and procedures that are related to significant disproportionality. Therefore, we recommend that the goals align with the following: ways to improve policies and procedures, selecting appropriate interventions, or providing professional learning that will enhance educator knowledge and skills within the practice. SMART goals provide a criterion for developing goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. Take a moment to pause the video and review the following criterion for creating a SMART goal. Now let's look at an example goal that is created based on a root cause analysis. In this example, the root cause is there is currently an unclear special education evaluation referral process for students who may have a disability. Therefore, the hypothesis is, if we develop a clear process for special education evaluation, then we can ensure the correct students receive evaluations. Based on this root cause and the hypothesis, our goal is to evaluate and revise district policies on the special education evaluation referral process by the end of the school year. So thinking about our SMART goals, is this goal specific? Is it measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound? If not, how would you revise this goal? Note that this slide has a corresponding activity in your participant guidebook. Once you've identified your goal and you are engaging in this exciting change process, you should follow this process for identifying and selecting practices. First, we will assess the effectiveness of your current practice. What are you doing within your LEA in the area of your identified root cause? If data supports that what you are doing is working, continue doing that. Your action plan may just extend your implementation efforts, and that's okay if sound evidence supports it. Next, we'll choose practices or programs that are directly aligned to your root cause to explore. Then we will discuss how to check these practices are measurable, evidence-based, and culturally sustaining. Finally, we'll work together to select the most impactful practices to implement first. We'll talk about how to evaluate the perceived benefit for each practice we identify and choose 1 to 3 practices that will be most impactful. A critical part of this process is ensuring that the practices and programs we select are measurable, evidence-based, and culturally sustaining. You'll learn more about culturally sustaining practices in other webinars. Once you start implementing your selected practices, it's possible you may not see the results that you are immediately hoping for. There are many components for successful implementation, and we know from implementation science that it can take as much as 3 to 5 years before we see successful implementation of a comprehensive framework or new process. It's possible that schools that are implementing certain elements, but not all components with fidelity, or at least not yet. A lack of fidelity paired with a poor selection of practices or assessments and a poor implementation are all barriers to successful implementation. One resource you can use when you're selecting practices is the FAIR test. This resource was developed by the National Center for Systemic Improvement. The FAIR test can be used to examine if an intervention, assessment tool, or instructional strategy is right for your site or for your district. The letters in FAIR stand for feasibility, acceptability, impact, and relevance. So thinking about feasibility, is this something that your school can reasonably implement? Do you have the resources to implement this program or the practice? Acceptability, do you have enough stakeholder buy-in? What do the parents think about this new protocol or this new practice or this new program? Impact, that refers to the level of evidence that supports this new initiative. Is it scientifically based? Is it an evidence-based practice? What supports the impact of that practice? And then relevance, making sure that our new initiatives align with the needs of our school identified through this root cause analysis process. Evaluating practices using FAIR can ensure that we are selecting practices that are not only evidence-based, but also contextually and culturally important. Here are some questions to consider when implementing the FAIR test. For feasibility, is it possible to implement the practice, intervention, or program with fidelity? Acceptability. What do faculty, staff, families, students, and other stakeholders think about the program and the goal? Impact. What is the evidence for the selected practice? And finally, relevance. Does the practice, program, or intervention meet the specific needs of the student? Addressing disparities involves changing policies and procedures as well as adult attitudes, knowledge, and behavior. Your action plan is likely going to emphasize an entire suite of strategies, such as providing training and supports for all school staff, eliminating problematic practices, and creating and applying fair and equitable policies for all students, as well as employing positive behavioral approaches, restorative practices, and mental health support. The key to your action plan is identifying interventions that address the drivers and the root causes of disparities in your school or district, as well as selecting evidence-based approaches, programs, or practices that your school district has the capacity to implement effectively. Effective implementation includes providing adults with the supports they need to master new approaches and practices, and providing students with the supports they need to succeed academically and manage their own behavior. Developing a communication plan, providing timelines, and assigning responsibilities will become crucial to successful implementation of your action plan. Developing a clear and sustainable plan of action can honor the effort that everyone puts into this process, incorporating everyone's voice, experiences, and ideas. It also helps to build trust prior to tackling the change process and keeps the lines of communication open to discuss what's working and what needs to be adjusted. Thinking more specifically about your action plan, it's important to know that an action plan should include both short and intermediate term strategies as well as long term strategies. Short and intermediate term strategies aim to change the drivers and mechanisms identified in your root cause analysis. These strategies also may address changing disciplinary practices and enhancing teachers' classroom management skills. Examples could involve implementing restorative practices in high schools or revising the code of conduct to exclude willful defiance as a reason for suspension or expulsion. Longer-term strategies aim to improve disciplinary practices, including improving data collection and further improving school climate and engagement. Specific strategies could include taking additional steps to improve student attendance, connectedness, and social and emotional competence. You want to develop a menu of interventions for your action plan that demonstrate logical links connecting your data to the root causes you identified, and then select the effective strategies that can be implemented effectively within your school or district. We are now going to implement and refine. We are now on the 5th step of our 5-step framework for addressing significant disproportionality: implement and refine. Now that we have developed a plan for action, it's time to implement that plan and then refine it, meaning we're going to need to take steps to monitor the plan in order to identify areas for further improvement. Part of the implementation process is aligning our new processes and initiatives with current processes, such as MTSS or multi-tiered system of supports. MTSS is a multi-level prevention system in which the purpose is to provide a continuum of supports for all students, regardless of classification or background, and to allow for appropriate match between need and supports. In a robust MTSS system, there should be high leverage practices, evidence-based practices, and evidence-based interventions that are used to provide this continuum of supports. Aligning our efforts with significant disproportionality with MTSS will help ensure that we are utilizing resources and supports effectively to avoid inappropriately identifying students for special education. Equity should always be the overarching goal of any systemic change. We know that research calls for the need for culturally responsive intervention processes to reduce disproportionality and the need for a conceptual framework to address the disproportionate representation of CLD students in special education, as this cuts across policies, people, and practices. And we also know that MTSS has the components necessary to address disproportionality and inequity within our school systems. By utilizing an existing framework such as MTSS, we can ensure that we are effectively using our already available resources to address the issues and root causes behind significant disproportionality. Another benefit to MTSS is that it addresses disproportionality by aligning systems and supports based on the whole child. There is no such thing as a Tier 2 or Tier 3 student because each individual student has strengths and areas of need. For example, a student may have a strong math calculation skill set but struggle with word problems because their reading fluency is low. The MTSS process gets to the root of the problem by using data to determine student needs and to inform instructional practices. There are 2 main goals in establishing a monitoring plan. The first is to monitor the progress made towards both short-term and long-term goals for each strategy defined in your intervention plan across time. We must engage in continuous reflection and improvement based on ongoing progress towards these goals. To achieve these goals, the monitoring plan is based on a sequence of 4 decisions made cyclically throughout the plan implementation. The following questions will be used to guide the next section. What is the purpose? What is the tool or measure? What is the timeline? And what are the tasks and who is responsible? Before you begin to develop your own plan for monitoring progress, let's talk about the purpose and the why behind monitoring the progress of a plan. The purpose of the progress monitoring plan is to evaluate and track progress towards your goals or desired outcomes. Evaluating and monitoring your progress allows for mid-course corrections and avoids wasting time in practices that are not working in your LEA setting. To achieve your long-term goals, you will want to consider the steps, activities, actions, and tasks that are critical to successfully implementing your action plan and making changes in your LEA. How do you currently monitor progress in your work? You will use the results from your progress monitoring process to reflect on and improve your action plan moving forward. The goal is to assess the fidelity of implementation and the effectiveness of the activities you choose so that you know which activities to build on, which activities need refinement, and which activities are not working to achieve your long-term goal. This process also may help you identify new practices you may want to start using. The goal of monitoring progress is to understand how each action you take impacts or does not impact your long-term equity goals for the students experiencing the effects of disproportionality within your LEA. Please take a moment to pause the video and reflect on the different items on this screen. Note that there is a corresponding activity within the participant guidebook. Now that you have a plan and you're implementing the plan, how will you know that the practices are being done with fidelity? A few questions to consider is how are you going to check for fidelity? How will you check to see if the practice is being done at a high level of quality? How often will you be checking for fidelity? Who is going to be responsible for checking for fidelity? And what will you do if fidelity is not being demonstrated? These are all items to consider when you are formulating your plan for implementation so that everyone knows your expectations, how often they should be circling back with you, how often data is going to be collected and monitored. We are now nearing the end of this presentation and wrapping up. Considering implementation science, it's important to remember that research says it takes as much as 5 years for full implementation of a comprehensive frameworks or processes. There are always areas for growth when establishing any new initiative. Thinking about the road to continuous improvement, it's likely your school or district will be revisiting these 5 steps multiple times, and that's okay. Part of the work of addressing significant disproportionality is committing to the process so we can continue to see results. In conclusion, here are some key takeaways from today's session. Developing infrastructure is necessary to effectively address disproportionality. School leadership teams play a key role in ensuring practices that are occurring and monitoring for effectiveness. This workshop is the second in a series of 5 workshops designed to help you and your team address significant disproportionality. We hope that you and your team will join us for all the workshops in this series. Each session is designed to build knowledge and skills that will conclude with an action planning session to set you up for success. The next workshop in this series is about discipline and behavior management systems. Then the following workshop is on inclusive practices, strategies to support student access. We hope that you continue to join us. Thank you so much for your time and attention today in learning about disproportionality, creating an infrastructure for results. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and have a wonderful day.